The sun blazed down on Crestwood Lane, a neat suburban street lined with manicured lawns and identical two-story homes, where nothing much ever happened until that afternoon. An ambulance had pulled up to the curb just minutes ago, lights flashing silently. A man had collapsed on the sidewalk, and the call for help had been immediate. The paramedic, a tall, steady-handed professional named Erik Lane, had arrived swiftly and dropped his knees beside the unconscious man, beginning CPR without hesitation. Erik had seen worse. The man was mid-50s, pale, unresponsive, and likely in cardiac arrest. Erik focused on compressions, his hands rising and falling rhythmically on the man's chest. He didn't hear the footsteps at first, or the voices. He only heard the breath he was trying to restore. Then came the interruption. A woman in her early 60s, with a clipboard pressed tightly against her chest like a badge, stood nearby, barking questions. Her name was Margaret Hensley, president of the local homeowners association, a title she wielded like a sheriff's star. Behind her were two men, also from the HOA board, arms crossed, expressions pinched with concern or annoyance. It was hard to tell. Margaret took a bold step forward. "You can't do that here," she said sharply. "You're not authorized to be on this property. This is HOA jurisdiction." Erik barely glanced up. "Ma'am, I'm performing CPR. This is a medical emergency." "You're on private property," she snapped. "You need to stop and wait for approval. We didn't clear this." Erik ignored her, checking the man's pulse, repositioning his hands. "Call dispatch if you have a problem. Right now, I'm trying to save a life." Margaret turned red. Her voice raised an octave. "You're trespassing, and I'm warning you. This is against protocol. We had issues with unapproved emergency personnel before." Somewhere behind her, a bystander recorded everything on their phone. In most neighborhoods, this would have been resolved with a quick apology or move to help. But Crestwood Lane had become notorious, quietly, for a brand of overregulation that some called tyranny in pastel colors. Rules were rules, and Margaret enforced them like gospel. To her, Erik's presence was an infraction, not a service. She made a call, not to 911. She'd already spoken to them, but to local private security affiliated with the HOA. Within minutes, a patrol car, not police, arrived and parked next to the ambulance. A younger officer, clearly caught between orders and ethics, stepped out hesitantly. "Sir," he said, approaching Erik slowly, "we need you to step away." "He's not breathing," Erik replied without stopping. "I have a duty to continue CPR." The officer shifted uncomfortably. "I understand, but the HOA is requesting immediate removal. They say you're not approved. I have to ask you to comply." Erik's voice remained calm. "I won't stop until EMT backup arrives, or until this man starts breathing again. If that's a problem, you can take it up with the state board." The officer hesitated, too long for Margaret. She stepped forward herself and, in a stunning act of overreach, grabbed Erik's shoulder. That was when Erik stood up, heart racing not from fatigue, but frustration. "Don't touch me. You're interfering with a medical emergency." Margaret didn't flinch. "You're under citizen's arrest." The moment froze. The man on the ground remained still. The paramedic, trained to deal with trauma, blood, broken limbs, was suddenly the subject of an entirely different kind of emergency. The HOA security officer moved in and, after a few seconds of awkward, reluctant coordination, handcuffed Erik on the sidewalk. The bystander's phone recorded everything. The camera didn't blink as the paramedic was pulled away from the man whose chest he'd just been compressing. His hands, marked with the grime of fight for life, now interrupted. Erik didn't resist, but he made one final plea. "Call real paramedics," he said, "or he dies." An eerie quiet fell over the street. Residents had emerged from their homes, drawn by the flashing lights and growing tension. Some clutched their phones. Others just watched, unsure whether to intervene or keep their heads down. And then, too late, the city ambulance pulled in. Real EMTs ran toward the scene, eyes widening as they saw one of their own being escorted away in cuffs. Margaret folded her arms triumphantly. "We enforce the rules here," she muttered. What she didn't know was that within 24 hours, her statement, her face, and the entire incident would become the center of a national controversy. The video would be shared millions of times. Headlines would scream about the arrest of a paramedic mid-CPR. And not long after, a civil rights attorney named Marcus DeWitt would file suit against the HOA for $10 million, calling it one of the most blatant acts of reckless endangerment and authoritarian overreach he'd ever seen. But in that moment, under the hot suburban sun, the only thing that mattered was that a man had stopped breathing, and the person trying to save him had been silenced. The legal storm didn't wait long to gather. By the following morning, news vans dotted the edge of Crestwood Lane. Microphones waved in front of residents like windshields in a car wash. The footage of Erik Lane, still in his navy blue uniform, still breathing heavily from CPR, as he was handcuffed and led away by a jittery security officer, had exploded online. Every headline repeated the same phrase, "Paramedic arrested mid-CPR." A phrase so absurd that some assumed it had to be satire. It wasn't. Marcus DeWitt, a civil rights attorney with a reputation for turning quiet violations into public reckonings, didn't need convincing. He watched the video twice and called Erik before the morning coffee had cooled. By noon, he stood on the steps of the county courthouse, surrounded by reporters, with Erik beside him. His voice was measured, but there was an edge beneath the polish. What happened on that sidewalk wasn't just obstruction. It was criminal interference, Marcus said. My client was performing a lawful, life-saving medical intervention when he was detained by an entity with no legal authority to do so. This is a clear violation of constitutional rights, and yes, we will be filing suit. Erik said nothing to the cameras. He hadn't slept. The image of the man on the ground, still motionless when the EMTs finally took over, kept flashing behind his eyes. Whether the man lived or died hadn't yet been shared. That silence gnawed at him more than anything Margaret had said. Meanwhile, Margaret Hensley wasn't hiding. She stood by her actions. When approached by reporters, she didn't blink. He wasn't authorized, she said, as if the sentence explained everything. That sidewalk is HOA-managed property. We've had issues in the past. We acted according to our rights as outlined in the association's charter. But that charter, Marcus knew, held no water in the context of emergency medical response. HOA guidelines might dictate lawn lengths and fence styles, but they did not override state law. And under that law, emergency medical personnel were granted wide protections during active duty, including when acting on private property. The Good Samaritan statute, reinforced by state precedent, made it clear responders could not be hindered or penalized for rendering aid in good faith. The conflict wasn't merely legal, it was moral. Erik had entered that neighborhood with one goal: save a life. He'd made no threats, broken no windows, climbed no fences. He'd done chest compressions on an open sidewalk. And yet, someone in a position of community power had looked at him not as a hero, but as a violator of policy. That disconnect spoke volumes. The city's police department issued a statement of neutral concern, distancing themselves from the HOA's decision and noting that private citizen enforcement of bylaws does not equate to legitimate legal authority. It was a carefully constructed sentence that said what it needed to while leaving out everything it feared. But it wasn't enough. Within hours, legal experts weighed in across every news network. Professor Linda Arrows, an expert in emergency services law, summed it up succinctly on a cable panel. If you're obstructing a paramedic in the middle of CPR, you're not protecting property. You're endangering lives. Full stop. Marcus began assembling his case with surgical precision. He requested HOA records, security dispatch logs, any documentation Margaret or her board had filed to justify the incident. Every word was ammunition. He filed the suit within 2 days. Interference with emergency services, false detention, violation of civil rights, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The suit wasn't just about Erik anymore. It had become symbolic. A case study in what happens when authority is misunderstood, when people confuse regulation with control, and when human life becomes secondary to power plays. Still, Erik wasn't interested in symbolism. He was thinking about the pulse he never found. The man's name had been Robert Kilburn, 56, a former high school teacher. divorced diabetic, with a weak heart and a daughter who'd driven in from 2 hours away after hearing the news. He hadn't made it. Erik found out on the third day. The hospital had done everything they could, but without those precious minutes of uninterrupted CPR, the outcome had become inevitable. Robert had died 15 minutes after arriving at the ER. Erik sat alone in the station break room when he heard. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. But he stopped returning calls that day, even from Marcus. The lawsuit would continue. Public opinion remained a wildfire. Margaret Hensley had gone from tight-lipped to openly combative, giving interviews to sympathetic local stations and defending the integrity of the neighborhood's policies. Her argument, however, began to crumble under scrutiny. No part of the HOA charter gave authority to detain licensed medical personnel. No section overrode public safety codes. And more damning, there had been no record, zero, of past incidents with emergency services, as Margaret had claimed. It had been a fabrication to justify a power move, one that had cost a man his life and placed a paramedic in handcuffs instead of at his patient's side. And still, Erik remained quiet. Marcus had warned him that the coming months would be long. There would be depositions, possibly hearings, and certainly opposition from HOA attorneys with deep pockets and little remorse. But the truth, Marcus said, was on their side. And sometimes, just sometimes, that was enough. What neither of them knew yet was how far this case would go, or who would stand with them when it did. Because lawsuits don't end stories. They often begin them. And the battle for accountability had only just begun. By the time the first court summons was delivered to Margaret Hensley's front porch, the once proud HOA president had already begun to feel the walls closing in. The lawsuit had transformed her from a local figure of minor power to the face of unchecked authority, and her once loyal board had grown increasingly silent. Some distanced themselves in public. Others denied having supported her decision at all. Behind the trimmed hedges and symmetrical lawns of Crestwood Lane, whispers traveled faster than the breeze. Erik Lane, meanwhile, had returned to work, not out of readiness, but out of need. He moved through his shifts like a shadow, competent and composed, but hollow in a way his colleagues noticed and respected without questioning. The weight of Robert Kilburn's death followed him like a silent second heartbeat. His hands still knew what to do, but they no longer moved with the same instinctive urgency. Each siren blared with the memory of being pulled away mid-rescue. He hadn't been able to save Robert, but maybe, through the lawsuit, he could prevent another Erik from ever being interrupted again. Marcus DeWitt pressed forward with the suit like a general mapping terrain. Every motion he filed was deliberate, every interview clipped and strategic. He wasn't just targeting Margaret or the HOA. He was taking aim at a larger issue, the creeping expansion of authority within private communities. In an era of gated neighborhoods and private patrols, Marcus argued, the balance between property rights and public safety had tilted dangerously. The initial hearing drew a crowd that surprised even the courthouse staff. Activists, emergency responders, legal observers, they all packed the benches. Margaret arrived with 2 attorneys in tailored suits and a demeanor that suggested defiance rather than remorse. She gave a thin-lipped nod to the cameras outside, but her confidence faltered when Erik entered the courtroom. He wore his uniform, not for show, but because he'd come directly from a call. His face was calm, yet unreadable. For the first time since the incident, Margaret looked uncertain. Inside, the opposing legal team squared off. Margaret's attorneys leaned heavily on property law, arguing that HOA charters were protected documents, granting wide latitude to manage the neighborhood as they saw fit. Marcus dismantled the claim in minutes. Emergency response isn't optional, he said, voice steady. It isn't subject to HOA approval, and it certainly isn't something to be delayed or denied because of arbitrary gatekeeping. My client didn't trespass. He did his job. But the core of the conflict wasn't technical. It was emotional. The video played in the courtroom. Every gasp, every order, every second Erik fought to save Robert before being interrupted played out in haunting clarity. Jurors flinched. Reporters scribbled furiously. Even Margaret looked away for a moment as her voice crackled through the footage. "You're under citizen's arrest." That phrase, now infamous, echoed like a brand. Outside the courthouse, public sentiment boiled over. Petitions circulated demanding criminal charges. The State Emergency Medical Board released a formal statement backing Erik and calling for legislative changes that would reinforce respondent protections in private communities. Local politicians, seeing an opportunity, began to rally behind the cause. What began as a neighborhood incident had become a movement, and still, Erik kept his head down. After the first hearing, he stepped outside alone. A woman approached him hesitantly. She introduced herself as Emily Kilburn, Robert's daughter. She hadn't come to speak in court, but she had watched the video and followed every update. Her eyes shimmered as she spoke. "My dad didn't survive, but I want you to know he had a chance because of you. No one else tried. You did." Erik didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was low. "It wasn't enough. It was more than anyone else gave him," she said. "And it's why I'm going to testify. They need to hear from someone who lost something real." That moment pierced through the fog Erik had been carrying. He realized that while he couldn't reverse what happened, he could still fight for what should never happen again. He wasn't just a paramedic. In this case, he was a witness, a victim, and perhaps the last advocate for a man who died with no one else beside him. Margaret, in contrast, withdrew. Her public appearances dwindled. Her lawyers advised silence. Internally, the HOA board had begun proceedings to remove her. The tide had turned, and even her iron grip on community policy couldn't stop it. The very rules she clung to were being used to show her the door. As discovery proceeded, Marcus unearthed damning emails, messages sent between Margaret and board members suggesting a pattern of exclusion, paranoia about outsiders, and a desire to reclaim control over neighborhood interactions. It painted a picture not of responsible governance, but personal vendettas masked as policy. The case was moving quickly now. The judge, sensing the public's watchful eye, denied motions to dismiss. A trial date loomed. But even as the legal machine churned forward, the human element remained central. Erik and Emily met again, this time for coffee. They didn't talk about the lawsuit. They talked about Robert, about his love for woodworking, his inability to ever fully retire, and the little backyard garden he kept meticulously even after his heart began to fail. Erik listened, not as a paramedic or a plaintiff, but as a man who had stood beside another in his final moments and needed to understand who that man had been. They left the cafe with no resolution, but a shared understanding. The damage was done. The lawsuit might bring justice, or it might not. But telling the story, refusing to let it be buried under procedure and policy, that was something neither of them would let go. The courtroom lights would shine again soon, and Erik would return to the witness stand. But as he walked back to his car that evening, he felt, for the first time in weeks, like he could breathe. The fight wasn't over, but it was worth continuing. The courtroom was hushed as Erik Lane took the stand for the final time. Every eye was on him, and every camera outside the courthouse waited to capture the ripple of justice or the silence of disappointment. His uniform was pressed. His hands, usually so precise and steady, fidgeted slightly on the wood of the witness box. But his voice, when he began to speak, was clear. I didn't go to Crestwood Lane looking for trouble. I went because someone was dying. Faster than the breeze. No dramatics. Erik Lane, meanwhile, no flourishes. Had returned to work. Just the truth. Not out of readiness. Across the aisle, out of need. Margaret Hensley sat flanked by her attorneys. Her once flawless posture wilted with fatigue. The tight line of her jaw remained, without question. But the fire that had once burned behind her decisions had dulled. Her name had become a national symbol of misplaced authority. Her fall from HOA president to defendant in a $10 million lawsuit had stripped away the illusion of invincibility she had carefully cultivated. Erik continued, I did what I was trained to do. He could prevent another I followed the law. I followed my conscience. And I followed my duty. But I was stopped not by circumstance, not by nature, but by someone who believed that a rule book mattered more than a heartbeat. He wasn't just the courtroom didn't move. Even the judge, who had been stern and efficient throughout the proceedings, paused with his pen midair. Marcus DeWitt stood just behind the prosecution table, listening carefully, but no longer needing to guide. and public safety. The case had spoken for itself dangerously through evidence, video, testimony, and character. A story had been told not just of legal overreach, but a system that allowed power to concentrate in the hands of people untrained and unequipped to use it responsibly. Emily Kilburn had testified the day before. She'd stood with a photograph of her father, Robert, held firmly in both hands. He taught for 30 years, he wore his uniform, and all he wanted was a peaceful retirement. When his heart gave out, Erik tried to save him. Margaret tried to stop that. One of them gave him a chance. Looked uncertain. The other didn't. No one cross-examined her. Now, as the closing arguments loomed, the emotional arc of the case merged with the legal one. Marcus paced before the jury, not with bombast, but with calm certainty. This isn't about whether HOAs can enforce property regulations. It's about whether those regulations can override the sanctity of a human life. This isn't a story about a mistake. It's a story about a deliberate choice, a choice to value power over people and policy over compassion. He pointed to Erik. That man acted with humanity. He didn't ask whose sidewalk it was. He didn't look for permission. Every second Erik fought to save Robert before when the defense stood, their tone was quieter than in previous days. Their strategy had shifted from denial to damage control. Ms. Hensley misunderstood her authority. One attorney conceded. She didn't act maliciously. She believed she was protecting the neighborhood. But belief, the courtroom understood, wasn't the same as legality. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Outside, protesters and supporters had gathered. Signs read, protect paramedics, not policies, and a life isn't an inconvenience. National EMT organizations sent statements of solidarity. HOA oversight committees from other cities quietly began reviewing their charters, nervous when the jury returned. Their verdict was read with measured gravity. For the charge of unlawful detainment of a first responder, we find the defendant liable. For interference with emergency medical services, we find the defendant liable. For a violation of civil rights, liable. For emotional distress, liable. Damages, $10 million, full amount requested. Erik didn't react. He blinked once, then looked down. Margaret slumped into a chair. Her expression unreadable. The judge called for order as the room stirred with reaction, but it wasn't chaos. It was relief. Outside, reporters rushed to catch statements. Marcus gave a brief comment. This verdict affirms that emergency responders are not to be obstructed, intimidated, or silenced. Today is a win not just for my client, but for every paramedic, firefighter, and police officer who risked their life in service of others. Emily approached Erik again, this time with a small smile. He'd be proud, she said. I just wish he'd lived long enough to see this, Erik replied. She nodded. Me too. In the weeks that followed, the impact of the verdict rippled outward. Several states began drafting new legislation explicitly protecting emergency responders from interference by non-governmental authorities. Training programs for HOA boards began to include segments on legal boundaries and emergency protocols. What happened on Crestwood Lane became a case study, a cautionary tale, and a catalyst for change. Margaret Hensley vanished from public view. Her home was eventually listed for sale. Her reign over the neighborhood ended not by vote, but by verdict. Crestwood Lane returned to its quiet existence, but the stain remained. Some residents planted a tree near the spot where Robert collapsed, a quiet memorial to a man whose final moments had sparked national reflection. Erik stayed on the job. He turned down several media requests, refusing to let the spectacle define him. For him, the story had never been about publicity. It had been about doing the right thing, and about standing firm when it mattered most. One evening, months later, he found himself at another call. Different neighborhood, different patient. As he performed CPR, a woman ran out of a nearby house and stood at the edge of the scene. Do you need anything? She called. No, ma'am. Erik said between compressions. But telling the story, just space. Refusing to let it be buried under procedure. You got it. Thank you for what you do. Neither of them would let go. Just like that, the world felt a little more right again. And Erik would return to the witness stand. But as he walked back to his car that evening, he felt, for the first time in weeks, like he could breathe. The fight wasn't over, but it was worth continuing.